giving the introduction. So thank you very much for your attention.
Nir, as you're about to find out, has a background not in biology, but in physics. Nir, I couldn't find your CV anywhere online, but we exchanged details over WhatsApp. So Nir did his PhD in physics in quantum mechanics at the Israel Institute of Technology. Then he did a postdoc in Urbana-Champaign, and then another postdoc at the Weizmann Institute, where he currently is the Lee and William Abramovitz Professorial Chair in Biophysics. Now, all this sounds very complex, and Nir could come across, on paper at least, as somewhat of an intimidating physics guy that's going to talk to you in ways and words you don't understand. In fact, I looked up the publication list, the most recent publication list from the lab, and actually I thought I was reading a typo on your website, because one of the very intimidating recent publications that Nir has written is called Excitable Solitons, Annihilation, Crossover, and Nucleation of Pulses in Mass-Conserving Activator-Inhibitor Media, which sounds something between a sci-fi film and one of the textbooks that put us all to sleep in high school. But the beauty of Nir, as I think you're about to find out, is that even though he has this knowledge, even though this is sort of his bread and butter, he's able to translate that and convert that into a way of speaking and communicating with us lower life forms like biologists that bridges that gap. And this morning I was inspired and thinking about how I was going to do this. And all I could think of was actually Bruce Lee, and a Bruce Lee quote, which is that simplicity is the last step of art. Actually, it's not a Bruce Lee quote. It's an old English poet, but Bruce Lee's taken the fame. But really, I think that's the message that I've always received in working with Nir and everyone that I've spoken to about working with Nir, is that this ability to translate and find the connections between fields, between physics, soft matter, physics, whatever it is, and animal behavior is an incredible gift and an incredible talent. And so I'm looking forward to hearing about how we're bridging that gap today in the context of AMP collective behavior. Thank you, Nir. Take it away.
Alex, thank you for embarrassing me the maximum that you could possibly do by setting such a high bar for my talk.
Nir, I'm going to embarrass you a little bit more, because I happen to know where you are. This also speaks of Nir's humility. So he lives in a household full of daughters and a wife. And so Nir has been confined to the bedroom because all of the daughters have taken up the desks to do their Zoom education. So there you go. We're getting a seminar from the bedroom, science from the bedroom. Thanks, Nir. Take it away.
Yep. Thank you very much for listening, for this seminar, and for inviting me. I will tell you about work which started, as you may have gathered from this introduction, completely by chance, about 6 years ago, and deals with the collective transport by ants, collective transport of food. Can you see my cursor? For example, you can see here a Cheerio, and you can see here an artificial piece of plastic, which the ants think it is food. Now, we summarize this line of work, which, as I said, stretched from 2014 till today, in this review article that came out 2 years ago that you're all invited to have a look at. Almost everything I will tell you is summarized in there, except for the last part of the work, which is summarized in a work which came afterwards. So I will tell you about what we think we understand about collective transport by ants. How does it emerge? How do ants actually manage to perform collective transport? And then the second part is this part about what do they do when they come across an obstacle? How do they collectively solve a problem? So first of all, the ants that we are dealing with are very small ants. Their nickname is crazy ants, but they are not crazy, of course, and they have a long Latin name, and they are all over the earth except Antarctica, I'm told. And you can see here what they do normally, they are removing dead animals, mostly dead insects, into their nests, and they do it collectively. They don't tear apart the animal on site like some ants do, but they actually transport. And you can see those in the front are clearly pulling on the tentacles of this cockroach, and those in the back seem to be maybe pushing, but actually lifting a little bit the object from the ground. And this was pictured outside on the grounds in Weizmann. And in fact, all the experiments done on collective transport are done outside. For some reason, my colleague who did these experiments, and I will show you his face in a second, tells me that it's impossible to convince them to do it inside the lab, although he does many experiments in the lab. All collective transport was actually measured outside. Another anecdote is that only humans and ants show collective transport, as far as I know, meaning that many animals, of course, do a lot of things together, but to carry something heavy that one cannot move over a significant distance is not shown by humans, is only shown by humans and ants. And of course, we are very different species, so we have very different modes of communication. So how do the ants do it in opposed to how we do it? So the first paper that came out, as you see, 5 years ago, actually summarized our basic modeling and the experiment, together with the experiments that go with it, of course, and motivated the modeling. So you see here a movie that shows you a typical experiment where a Cheerio that was actually smeared in cat food in order to make it actually interesting as a food item to the ants was actually followed by a camera on a tripod on a piece of paper that had a grid marked on it. And of course, all the numbers and all the color traces are added by the computer during the computer analysis of the movie. By the way, I see none of you and I have no feedback, so I feel I'm talking to myself. So please interrupt me or even, you know, make some strange noises so I know that I'm not alone here, okay? Thank you.
No problem.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That was good. Good. So these are the people that did the work. So Ofer, that you see here, he is in the physics department, and he is the head of the ant lab. And Aviram was at that time a PhD student, and Udi is Ofer's lab technician, you can say. In my group, the first two people who worked on it was Abhijit, who was a postdoc, and Itai, who did a PhD with me. And then the last piece of work that I will show you today was done by Jonathan, who was a master student at the time. So each ant, when she comes to the piece of food, she has to decide between pulling or lifting. This information we get from the experimentalists. And a movie demonstrates that. This piece of plastic here was again smeared in cat food in order to make it enticing for the ants. And you see that it's pretty much empty of ants. So these ants which come to it, they actually come to a piece of food which is not moving at all. So they have to decide what to do. They have no cue from the group what to do, because there isn't a group yet, there isn't a carrying group yet formed around this object. So what you see is that at first she tries to pull it, but then at some point she begins to lift it. And you see that she's doing very different things with her legs when she's either pulling or lifting. So this, and you can see actually cars going in the background, because as I said, this was all done in sort of natural conditions. So when many of them are already attached to the object and they have essentially lifted it from the ground, now you can see that they are very nicely coordinated and the object is actually moving very, very smoothly. Yes, they do change directions and they make some rotations, but the object is actually moving very, very smoothly over significant distances, many, many times its own body length, and it's no problem. It's clearly not the result of random pulling by ants all over the circular objects, which would clearly end up not moving the object anywhere, just a simple tug of war. So the model that we had to, that we thought to develop to explain this behavior was actually motivated by this experimental data that Ofer and his people gave us, which was that each ant as she is attaching onto the object, she needs to decide what role she wants to play. Will she be a puller or will she be a lifter? And clearly, in order to move the object in a particular direction, you must have a division of labor. You must have that those in the front will be mostly pullers, and those in the back will be mostly lifters. If there is no such division of labor and it is mixed everywhere, you go back to the tug of war, which is useless for the cooperative transport. Now, she has to decide whether she takes this role or that role upon attachment, but because the object can actually rotate and the direction of motion can actually swing around, she can actually attach in the back, but find herself after some time in the front. So all the time she needs to assess whether she's in the right role, and therefore we have a process of role changing while she is attached. So while she is attached, she can actually switch her roles. And of course, she can also detach at any given point. Now, there is another small complication which is shown here in this diagram, and that is that she's not necessarily attaching her body axis radially to this circular object. She can actually, with some angular flexibility in her head and mouthpiece, can actually reorient her body axis to be better aligned with the direction of motion of the whole group. And that realignment away from the radial direction means that now she's also applying torques. And that's actually the reason this thing is rotating mostly, or at least randomly, because of these realignments which make her give some random torque to the, oh, not random, but a torque to the object. So this is pictorially the model, and I will not go into the mathematics of the model very much, but I will just give you the most essential flavor of it. So the big puzzle is, of course, how do they coordinate their pulling efforts? How do those in the front know that they have to be pullers upon attachment, and those in the back know that they have to be lifters upon attachment, or later on as the object changes its direction of motion? And you could think that there are different ways to communicate that. For example, if you ask friends to help you move a big sofa in your apartment, then first of all, your division of labor is very similar. Those in the front will be pulling, those in the back will be certainly lifting the sofa away from the floor, and maybe actually pushing will not be so helpful because that will be problematic for those in the front. So at least you always ask those in the back just to be lifters, but you're talking to each other. So without talking to each other, it's difficult to communicate who does what and decide on the direction of motion. So the other, so without any evidence for any vocal interactions between them, you could think about pheromones. And pheromones play, of course, a key role in making them eventually get to the right place, which is the nest, because there is a pheromone trail that all these foraging ants have laid so that they can find their way back to the nest. But if you think about it, those that are actually doing the carrying, they have their head stuck against a very stinking object, be it a dead insect, or in this case, the Cheerio, which is smeared in cat food, and the antennas, which serve in order to sniff out the scent trail, are also on the same head where the mouthpiece is, which is holding on to the food item. So it's very difficult at the same time when you're carrying to also note the pheromone trail which leads you home. So it's difficult to think what modalities of sensory system can actually work here. And we thought that the simplest one will be simply by forces. So if I tell you not to communicate with each other while you're carrying this sofa, and I also blindfold you, then just by holding onto the sofa, you can tell what the other people around the sofa, holding onto the sofa, are doing. If the sofa is moving towards you, you can feel that. You can actually feel the force pushing on you from all the others, and that tells you that you're in the front. While if you feel that when holding onto the sofa, you're being pulled a little bit, it means that you're in the back. So we figured out that that's the minimum way of actually conveying information. And it's not a bad way of conveying information as long as the object on which the forces are exerted is not super soft. And I'll get to that just at the end of the seminar as something that we want to explore in the future. But at the moment, the Cheerio and certainly all the plastics that we've used are very rigid. And that means that the speed of sound is super fast compared to any other process in the problem. And that means a force which is exerted at some point is essentially instantaneously felt by all the others. So what we thought of is the following simple mathematical rule, which basically says that the rate at which a lifter is switching to become a puller is some Basel rate times this exponential factor. So this mathematical notation basically means that everything in the bracket is the exponent of E, of the natural log. And basically what we have in this exponent is the dot product between the direction, just the local direction of ant I, which is denoted here, with the force which is exerted by all the others on the object. And this is a vector and this is a vector. So the dot product between two vectors is dependent on the angle between them. So if they are both pointing in the same direction as shown for this end, for example, then the dot product of two vectors is positive. And that means that you have a positive number here. F int, which is in the denominator, is just a positive constant, and I'll talk about it in a second. It actually plays a very important role in everything I will discuss. But it is positive. So the sign of this dot product is just determined by the directions. If they're pointing in the same directions, this is positive, and then exponential of a positive number is a very large number, which means that if I'm in the front and I was a lifter, the rate at which this ant will switch from lifter to puller is very large, which is exactly what we want, because she shouldn't be a lifter in the front. And the reverse process of the rate of switching from being a puller to a lifter has exactly the same mathematical form, but with a minus sign. So now we have a negative number in the exponent, and exponential of a negative number is small, which means that she will be unlikely to switch back to being a lifter. The rate of switching back from puller to lifter is a small number, which means that the time it takes for this process to occur is very long. And of course, the reverse is that if the dot product is the opposite sign, which means that she's in the back with respect to this total force exerted by all the pullers. So forces are exerted by the pullers, and lifters, essentially in this model, they're only reducing the friction coefficient, but as you saw, this very quickly saturates, because as soon as there's enough ants, the object is essentially off the ground, and any additional lifter is essentially not doing anything. So basically, we have almost those that are almost not doing anything, which are lifters, but they should be not doing anything in the back, and those in the front, which are pullers. Now, the role of this constant, F int, we gave it the subscript int to denote individuality, but it's exactly like an effective temperature if you are familiar with such exponential factors appearing as Boltzmann factors, where you have on the top part in the numerator something which looks like the energy difference for some process to occur, and the temperature, the effective temperature. So here on the top part, we don't have energy, we have direction and units of force. So on the bottom, in order to make this entire thing in the brackets dimensionless, we have to have something which is units of force instead of units of energy, which is like temperature. And we gave it the subscript F int. And why do we think it's temperature is similar to individuality in this problem? For the following reason. If we make this parameter very large, this is like a very individualistic system. In which sense? In the sense that the ants essentially ignore the forces that are applied on it. Each ant is switching back and forth from lifter to puller completely randomly. So it's a half and half chance of being a puller or a lifter, independent of where you are on the object and independent of the total force, the instantaneous total force, which is applied on the object and therefore felt by the end. If F int is 0 or approaches 0, it means perfect conformism. So the ant perfectly obeys the cue from the load, which means that in the front, all of them are all of them are pullers, and in the back, all of them are lifters, and there is just no exception. So it's equivalent to an effective temperature. The system is very ordered at low temperatures and very disordered at high temperatures. Is that okay? Is there any question or?
Makes sense.
Like, why did we choose that? Or okay. Okay. So now clearly, it's clear to you that ants are not in this perfect individualism scenario because they are not in the tug of war when carrying this food item, and you would expect a priori that ants are conformists. I mean, they're almost like the prime examples of what it means to be in a conformist society. And therefore, you expect this to be small. How small?
Can I ask a question?
You don't know. Yeah.
Just for a second. Do I get it right from the formula that this F end is the thing that gives, because there's nothing in your formula that gives the direction where the collective should go?
Yes, exactly.
Unless the F end would be the one that gives the information that the single animal has.
No. The F end doesn't give the information of where to go. It's a scalar parameter. It's not a vector. But where to go is actually not yet discussed in this model. I'm actually only now saying how do they coordinate themselves to go somewhere. And where to go, that's actually a very interesting problem that we'll get to in a few slides.
But the animal with a high F int should be the animal that has more knowledge.
No, the animal with a high F int is the animal that ignores the group, but it's also switching between pulling and lifting in a disastrous way, in the sense that if she's in the front, she's switching to being a lifter and therefore not helping at all the group effort, or even worse, in the back, she's switching into being a puller, which means that she's pulling against the group. So very high F int is detrimental to being ordered. Very low F int is highly ordered. And now the question is, of course, how high how low F int do you want in order to be ordered enough, maybe, in order to produce this collective transport? Now, what you said about the fact that those ants that actually know where to go should ignore the group, you're right, but we don't treat that part of the dynamics as if it's a manipulation of F int, but we simply, as you'll see in a few more slides, we simply treat those ants, which we call them knowledgeable ants or informed ants, as behaving differently for a certain short period of time. I'll get to that in a few more slides. But you're right that they have to ignore the group for that period of time. That's very observant. Okay, so what do we do with this model? We can actually write a computer program which simulates these rules and simulate, as much statistics as we want. And specifically, we compared the statistics to experimental data. So all the colored graphs that you see in these panels come from experimental data, but they come from experimental data which is very unique. It comes from a clean sheet, which means that we did an experiment where the group was actually forming on the object and beginning to carry it in the direction of the nest, but then very carefully, the object and the ants were actually moved to a clean sheet, to a sheet that had no pheromone marks on it. And there, the group actually reformed on the object, and now they continued their transport, but they did not go anywhere because there was no marking anymore to tell them where to go, but they were still carrying because they are poised to carry. And with that data, we could compare to our simulation model, because just like came out in the discussion a minute ago, the model as is doesn't actually say where the group would want to go. So you see that, for example, the experimental data is in color, and the simulation data is the black line that goes roughly well with all the experiments. This is the distribution of speeds. This is the speed versus number of ants. This is angular speed versus number of ants, etc., etc. And all the parameters in the model, such as the on rate and off rate, we tried to measure them. So at the end of the day, the only free parameter in the model was this f-ind, which is some internal parameter about the decision-making of an individual ant, which we cannot actually, at the moment, probe directly from an experiment. So that was the parameter that we fitted in order to fit all the experimental data to the simulation. Yeah. Okay, so we were very happy at this point, and then a friend came along, a visitor, and he asked me, but what's so special about this value of about 10 ant forces? You remember, it's in units of an ant force. What's so special about this value? So, as we said, it has to be small in order to have conformism. It cannot be too large, or there will be individualistic and basically just switch up and down, switch between pulling and lifter completely randomly. So is this value large? Is this value small? Why isn't it 1 or 0.1? I mean, why hasn't nature made it as small as possible? Because a priori you would think that being the perfect conformist is best, because if you have a larger f-int, it means that, yes, maybe you are still ordered, but from time to time, an ant in the back is pulling against the group, or an ant in the front is lifting instead of pulling. So that sounds strange. Why would we want to have that? So one answer you could give at this point is, well, you know, this is the best that an ant brain can do. It's a finite size system with finite neurons. It's noisy. It would have wanted to be more conformist and make less mistakes than what this number gives, but it's as noisy and it's as conformist as it could be. So this could be one answer. The other answer could be, well, you know, maybe there is an advantage of having this particular number, and actually evolution could have made this smaller. It could have made these ants into stronger conformists. But there is an advantage with this number. And when this visitor, Itai Cohen from Cornell, posed me these questions and started me thinking about this direction, we actually continued the research, and it proved very fruitful. So, as I said, f-int, we cannot actually probe directly in the ant brain. So what do? And as a teaser, I can give you this movie which tells you where this is going. And this is going in the direction of this question that I was asked about, how do they know where to go? So think about this group that I'll show you in the movie in a second. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ants, and they're actually going upwards. But the nest is on the left. And this ant, which comes from the nest, she's fresh from the nest, or she's at least fresh from the centrale that leads to the nest. And she could have been a carrying ant before, but she detached, and we found the centrale to the nest. She's now coming, and she wants to join the carrying, and you'll see that what she does is that she's pulling, and she's correcting the direction of the group in the correct direction. Now, she's also touching them, and that could potentially also give some information, but we didn't have any evidence for that. And even though she's one and there are 7 or 8, I can run this again, she and other ants like her are actually very successful. And along a track, you can see that when the group is meandering sideways, there's always a steady flux of individual ants, 1 or 2, which help re-steer them towards the nest. And we could prove from the experimental data that for a period of about 10 to 15 seconds, there is an improvement in the direction with respect to the nest. And after that, this improvement is lost, which means that this ant can pull correctly for that amount of time. And after that, she gets disoriented and she sort of forgets the direction to the nest, and she becomes just a regular carrying ant, which then employs the rules of these rates that these exponential rates that I was presenting before. So to answer the question that I was asked a few minutes ago, exactly, she has to ignore the group for about 10 to 15 seconds. We have like a constant rate at which she can forget which is the correct direction. But before she forgets, she's doing one thing and one thing only. She's pulling in the correct direction. And that means that even if she's attaching herself on the side, she will rotate the object and pull in the correct direction.
So I've seen when the ant is approaching from the nest ant is approaching from the left. At the same time, I also saw that from the right, more lifters appeared. Is that just by chance?
It's by chance. We didn't find any correlation with other ants. Yeah. It's a chance occurrence. But now, motivated by that experimental observation and by this nagging question that Itai planted in my brain, we went to our simulations. And in the simulations, we can actually vary this individuality parameter, which you remember we found to be about 10 for the experimental data. But now we can do the following simulations. We can start with the object in the origin, let's say, and it is with about 10 ants attached to it, and it is moving in any random direction that you want. And at time 0, we attach on one of the empty sites on that object an informed ant, which is doing one thing and one thing only. For 10 seconds, she's pulling in the direction of the nest, which is on the right. And we see what is the response of the group, how much the group actually moved as a whole in the correct direction in response to those 10 seconds of pulling. Now you can see that when you're in a very highly individualistic system where F-int is very large, 10 times larger than the experimental system, it's a tug of war. So the object is hardly moving, it's only making random walk. And yes, now the random walk is with a small drift, so there is some response, but it is very weak. When there are much more conformists than the experimental system, which is an F-int, which is an order of magnitude or even more smaller, you see by the motion that it is super smooth because it's like a locomotive. Those in the front are pulling, those in the back are lifting, and nobody's asking any questions. Individualism has been erased. And of course, if you happen to go in the right direction, you reach there first. But if you don't happen to go in the right direction, the one knowledgeable or informed ant is almost useless in actually redirecting the group. So the response is much weaker. And there is actually a peak. There is a peak in the simulation data around the value that we fitted, with some error, of course, to the experimental data. And to remind you, the experimental data to which we fitted this parameter was all kind of kinematic data, which had nothing to do with response to any informed ant. So for the first time, we thought, aha, evolution could actually pick this value because it actually is meaningful. So in order to understand it even more, here the physicist comes out again, and we say, well, let's go to a one-dimensional model. In this one-dimensional model, the object is simply a bar, which has just two ends. And again, each end can be a lifter and a puller, and the object can only move along this axis of the bar. And this is entirely equivalent to actually writing an Ising model. An Ising model was developed in order to explain how spins, ferromagnetic spins, form the transition from an object which is paramagnetic to an object which is ferromagnetic. So here we have a slight modification of that simple model because simply we have two subgroups of spins, which between each of them, they are interacting ferromagnetically, but between the two subgroups, they interact anti-ferromagnetically. So that's the only small modification to the regular ferromagnetic case that you have in an Ising model where spins tend to align below a critical temperature, and that's exactly what we have. So our individuality parameter, which we simulated here, can actually look like extremely similar to this result of the analytic one-dimensional model, which also shows a peak of the response as function of this individuality parameter, which, as I said, is entirely equivalent to changing the temperature and switching from the paramagnetic magnet to the ferromagnetic magnet below a critical temperature. So this peak in the susceptibility or in the response of the group to the informed ants is now not anymore a mystery. It is a symptom of a phase transition in the ant group, from a disordered ant group to an ordered ant group. Now, the problem is that, as I said, we cannot change F-ind in the experiment. It's sort of an intrinsic ant property. Some people told us, just blow marijuana smoke on the ants, that will do the trick, but I don't think it's a very controlled experiment, besides being a fun experiment for the student. But what can we do to probe this? So the same one-dimensional model that I showed you a minute ago, the result of it actually also predicted that instead of changing the temperature, we can simply change the number of ants. So a small group with few ants will behave like the high individuality, the high temperature disordered regime, and a large group will behave like the low temperature or the conformal and a low individuality ordered group. And we could now, after seeing that in the one-dimensional model, we could actually go back to the simulations and re-simulate this response of the group to a single 10-second pull by a single informed ant as function of now changing the radius of this two-dimensional ring, which simulates for us the plastic rings or the Cheerio. And again, we see that there is a peak around a particular size, which is actually by chance happened to be close to the size for which we fitted the model, which was about 0.5. So we said, aha, let's play with the size of these rings, and large rings should behave very ordered and very conformal, and small rings should be disordered. And that's actually the conclusion of where we are, that in fact we can actually vary the sizes. And I will show you that this variation in the sizes actually works in the second part. And this second part came by almost by chance, by actually tying the piece of food to a string. And by tying this piece of food to a string, we simply, those who did the experiment, simply expected to observe how this thing gets tight at some point because the nest is down below, and then nothing more should happen. But instead of that, the object actually started swinging. And this swinging behavior seemed to be completely puzzling. And why on earth should this group of ants move the object sideways if the nest is only down? If pulling towards the nest is like gravity, then why isn't this just hanging down and pointing towards the nest? What's actually making it go sideways? And at this point, we said, okay, can we believe this simple model that I told you about so far, and especially also its predictions about size dependence? And yes, this is the experimental data of the angle in blue and the angular velocity in green. And this is the simulation of the same model, not touching anything, not changing any parameter, but simply now constraining the object not to go beyond a certain radius as if it is held by a tight string. So this was a very strong vindication of the model, but then we also said, okay, we can actually use this setup actually maybe more easily to see the effects of size on this system. By the way, if you take in the simulation that there is no interaction between the ants, simply only those that are informed are pulling towards the nest, you get that the angle is around 0, just like you would expect if there would be just constant gravity. You don't have this motion sideways arising from the informed ants. So the informed ants don't inject any information to go sideways. It only comes out from the spontaneous ordering of these carrying ants. So indeed, the prediction was that there will be 2 peaks in the velocity distribution, in the angular velocity distribution, and the theory and the experiment sort of look, I would say, similar. And the same if you plot the angular velocity versus angle in phase space. Again, there is a similarity between theory and experiment. Now, as a function of size, we predicted that below a critical size, there will be no oscillations. And you see, this is the theoretical prediction for the distribution of these durations of persistent motion, which should actually be large for a large object and almost disappear for a small object. We see the same trend in the experiment, but it's not as sharp as in the theoretical prediction. So at this moment in time, although we very much believe so, we don't have a completely clear-cut experimental verification for this order-disorder transition, meaning a system that we can directly say this one is above the transition and this one is below. The problem here is that, as you see, the critical size is very small. It is for objects which can actually fit only something like 3 or 4 ends. So it is very difficult for such small systems to even talk about a phase transition, because phase transition usually are smeared out by finite size effect in small sizes. But at least the trend that it is much more persistent for large systems as opposed to small systems is indeed shown in the experiment. There was another piece of let me jump here. There was another piece of prediction that the model was able to give, which actually surprised the experiments, and that came out from actually doing a very simpler analysis of the model. And the simpler analysis was actually to replace this string by a rod, so not to allow any radial directions, which happened in the experiment and in the simulation, because the object can actually move in this direction and make the string completely go slack. And the number of attached end is fixed in this simplified model, and the pool of the informed end is really fixed, like I would say, as if it is an external gravity, but of course everything is in the plane. And if you solve that simple model, you actually predict 3 phases. One phase for a small group in which the object should only be actually vibrating around the angle 0, which is pointing towards the nest. There's at larger sizes, you have these oscillations, which appear as limit cycles in this angular velocity versus angle phase space. And at even larger sizes, you expect actually full rotations around the origin. And when we predicted that, the experimentalists actually said, no, this cannot be. This phase, which is circled here, makes absolutely no sense. Why on earth they will go all the way back, although the nest is down below? And of course, I wouldn't show you this movie if it actually didn't work. So the nest is somewhere here on the lower right, and you see that it does actually make a complete rotation. It does change direction, and from time to time, it does go back to those simpler oscillations, but it does make a complete rotation, although the nest direction, as I said, is on the lower right corner of this image. Here you see it can also switch direction. And it took them some time to find a rod to replace the string, which would be both rigid and lightweight enough, so it will not affect detrimentally the ability of the ends to move, but you can certainly see that it makes complete rotation. Yeah. So now what happens if you have a real-life situation and you have an obstacle? For example, think about the following situation. You find a cockroach here or some other food item, and all the ants which reached this food item, they came from a path, a scent trail that went underneath this obstacle and all the way to the object. But now, when they try to pull the cockroach back, they cannot actually pull it into that small crack. So they have to solve the problem, and the only solution of the problem is to go around the obstacle, either on this side or on this side, whichever one is actually simpler. And you can actually do an experiment like that. For example, here, you see this is a very large object. This is highly sped up, so don't worry. No ants are being squashed in the image which comes up next. And you see this Perspex barrier with a hole. So they did come through the hole. That was the original scent trail, but they cannot push the object through the hole, so the object is stuck. It makes sideways motions, which are the object of what I will discuss next. So it's actually clearer in a smaller object, because the smaller object actually very quickly is able to get around this obstacle. First of all, you saw that it completely missed this hole, but you can attribute that maybe to many new ants that are coming from below or from above, that is from the sides of the obstacle, and indeed such ants eventually direct it to go over the obstacle. But what is really happening? It's clear in the experiment that after hitting this barrier, this object is this food item is making lots of oscillations along the barrier. And the way the setup was built originally, it was not clear if it's changing direction by hitting those barriers, although you can clearly see in this chemograph that it does change direction before hitting the barriers. But this was not a very clean situation. So we first analyzed it theoretically, made some predictions, and then came to it experimentally. And that was the work of a joint student, Jonathan, that I mentioned. So what Jonathan decided is to start with this simplified one-dimensional model that I already sort of briefly introduced in the context of the pendulum motion. But now it's actually simpler. You move along a line, and if you're on the right of the hole, there is a constant force that points towards that location. And if you're on the left of that hole, there is a constant force pointing back into the hole. So it's a constant force, unlike the pendulum where the force changes as you move along because of the angle change. Here it's a constant force. So you can rewrite those equations of motion, and you get a non-linear dynamical system, which has in it the part which comes from the ordering of these ends, and that is similar to the Ising model equation of motion. And of course, there are these restoring forces that come from these informed ends, which are constantly trying to pull you towards the direction to the nest, because the informed ends know at the moment of only one opening that can actually lead you to the nest. Let's assume that there are there's no way around this obstacle. It's an infinite obstacle. So what Jonathan found is that, in fact, there are now 3 dynamical phases, and 2 of them are very interesting, because you can see that in this dynamical phase, for example, which is denoted here in orange as function of the restoring force and this F in, this individuality parameter, there's actually bistability, which means that you can actually start in this velocity and position phase diagram and end up in the origin, meaning you are stuck forever near the hole, or you can actually go off and make this trajectory in the blue line, which actually takes you away forever to one side or the other, away from the hole. There's another phase in which there is, again, bistability between being stuck near the hole and making these oscillations around the hole. So you move across the hole, right to the left, but with some finite amplitude. And although, as I said, the barrier continues forever, or there is a sort of a boring phase where you're simply stuck against the hole and you're not making these large sideways excursions. And it depends on the size of the hole, because as you remember, I told you that the hole makes an abrupt change from a force on the right and a force on the left. And as you make the size of the hole larger, you're in fact smearing this transition from a sharp force on the right to a sharp force on the left. And the more you're smearing, the more you're losing this bistability, and you go back only to this pendulum, or what we call the antulum limit, where there's no bistability and there's only these oscillations which go on forever. Now, in the simulations, we try to actually look out for this bistability, so these spontaneous switching between large sideways excursions and the being stuck next to the hole. And you can see that this object, yes, it is the full 2-dimensional simulations, so it can actually leave the barrier, and there it is, it's stuck. You see that its position is dead center, and its velocity is almost 0 around the origin, but then it leaves, it gets unstuck out of this stuck solution and begins again to make these large oscillations, which are very similar to the oscillations you saw in the case of the antulum. And in the experiments, we actually found that this depends very strongly on the size. And again, we could show that for large objects, it only makes the large sideways excursions. And you can see that now this there is no way for the ants to come from anywhere. This extends for, this is essentially a closed box, so they can only come out from here, and it makes these large oscillations as predicted. If you make it smaller, then the oscillations are smaller, but still, we don't predict that there will be any bistability from the simulations. And for the smallest size object that you can see here, here it is, another small object, it does from time to time get stuck. And here, for example, when the arrow was turned on, there was a period when it was stuck. And why do we think that this is interesting? Because it's, if you think about it, it's as if there is an emergent problem solving on the part of the collective of the ants. If you have a small object, then you have a larger chance of actually squeezing it, you know, turning it over and squeezing it through the hole. So there is it's more profitable to try and push it against the hole. A large object, there's no chance for that. So you're much better off immediately ignoring the hole and really going past the hole completely and looking sideways for ways around the obstacle. So it's as if they make this, you know, clever calculation, intelligent calculation, but they don't. All this problem-solving behavior that you see here is completely arising from the same simple set of rules that I showed you in the beginning, so that they are not flipping the manual of how to be a clever ant as soon as they find the obstacle. No, they do the same thing, and the problem-solving behavior is completely emergent on the collective level. There is no ant here that understands the problem and understands that there is a problem to be solved, or at least there is no need for any ant to be aware of the problem and aware of the problem that needs to be solved. So for
do they ever give up on that, or do they try?
So that question is very good, and actually it was also asked when we did the pendulum. They can go on for hours. Eventually, as I said, since this is done in natural conditions, the whole colony finds other sources of food, and they simply recruit these ants elsewhere, and the whole thing gets drained of ants. But no, they continue futilely to do that for hours upon hours, simply because there is no such case in nature that I guess that there's no simple way around, you know, a leaf or a branch or a stone. And if there is, you know, it's probably very, very rare. Okay, so these are a few comparisons. So that's basically just a cartoon to show you that indeed you come across a way to the nest, which was the shortest way, but now you begin to make these large oscillations as if you know that there is a way on the right or on the left. But as I said, no one ant actually knows that there is a problem here, and still it gets solved. All the work that I showed you so far was on rigid objects, and as you see, actually flexible objects are very different. I mean, so far they couldn't get it through in this movie, so you can say, well, it's as if this was a rigid ring of the same size, which cannot go through. But look what happens to the string. At some point, they manage to squeeze it, and we want to understand how do they do it, and in general, what happens to these rules which are based on force transmission when the forces get modified by elastic forces within the object. So just to wrap up, you know, we were excited because we think that there is like a phase transition in this system. A phase transitions always get physicists excited. It is arising naturally because it is the driving force for making them cooperative. And when you are cooperative, you switch from disordered to an ordered behavior. When there is a conflict, for example, between the information flow, which is the informed ants, which is like this gravity pulling in some direction, and an external constraint, be it the tether or the obstacle, we can see that there's new collective modes, which are these spontaneous oscillations, even this bistability, and even those large rotations, if the tether is rigid rod. And it seems like these modes, these new modes that arise from this conflict between the information flow and the constraint, it's as if these modes are exactly what they need in order to solve the problem, but in fact, nobody is aware of a problem that needs to be solved. So it just turns out like that. And yeah, that's just a nice movie to wrap it up. So I don't know until what time I was supposed to speak.
Well, again, we missed the applause, but I think everyone very much enjoyed that. And we do have some time for questions. So if there are any questions in the crowd, I'll clap so you can hear it, but that's on behalf of everyone here. I see some silent clapping. So if you do have a question, just unmute yourself and go for it.
Yes, Nir, could I have a follow-up question to what we discussed before?
Yeah.
About the F ind, the sort of temperature component in the Boltzmann equation.
Yeah.
If I got it right, this F ind is the same value for every individual ant. What would happen if it was a distribution? Would that parameter of how the distribution, how wide it is, would that influence the behavior of your group?
Yeah, so good, very good question. Maybe you were the referee of the 2015 paper, but it was indeed asked of us. Indeed, we assumed in the modeling that they are all the same because that's just the simplest thing to do. And in fact, what we found, maybe I go back here. What we found is that if you take this individuality parameter from some Gaussian distribution, which is not super wide, nothing qualitatively changes. It's only some quantitative change. But if, in fact, you have too many conformist ants, too many ants which have a very low individuality parameter, you actually run into problems. And you can see this here, that actually having a few ants which are super individualistic is not so detrimental because they don't really do much. They are pulling or lifting almost randomly. And yes, it's not helping anybody. It's like, having a few harmless hippies which are not really doing much harm. But having many super conformist people and ants, it can actually be very detrimental because now the effect of the informed ants in order to get them, to steer them in the right direction is rapidly getting lost. And since they are very much dependent on those flux of informed ants, which can be a very weak flux of 1 or 2 ants every so often, they will just leave the central. And then it's actually becoming very detrimental. So yes, they can tolerate some distribution of this parameter as long as it's not too heavy on the conformist side, on the low value side.
Which means that there must be strong evolutionary pressure on that parameter.
Well, you see, not so strong. There is some tolerance even by a factor, I would say, the variance can be, if the parameter value is 10, the variance can be, I think, even 3 or 4. So it's not super sharp around that value, and you still don't get large quantitative differences in the behavior. So off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly at which variance it actually begins to be problematic, but or you begin to lose the ability to stay on the central, measurably. But there is some pressure, but I cannot tell you that I know very much about this evolutionary pressure, in order to keep it super sharp.
Yes, thank you. Beautiful talk. Yeah, very nice. You mentioned briefly that, of course, if the object which is carried is super elastic, then of course the force information, and I understood that the essential channel of information is by the forces, might become a little bit distorted. My question is, if you would have a viscoelastic material, so then you would have a time delay. I mean, I guess this is not really relevant for
the ends, yeah.
Yes, for the end. But see, as a physicist, from one physicist to the other, might be you have thought about that. How that is changing the picture.
So we have thought about it, but we haven't actually done anything about it. And the next thing that we are meaning to do, and again, the experiments moved a little bit faster than what we had the manpower to treat, was actually to simply take objects, rigid objects, and connect them by a very soft spring. So that will be like a very simple system to start with, and both experimentally and from the theoretical point of view. And again, a very soft spring would mean that there will be a delay in transmitting the force, and it will be highly softened until it actually is transmitted fully. And there will be also, you know, a delay in the dynamics. And now you will actually be able to probe the dynamics that occur within each end, because each end has some switching rate from being a puller to a lifter, and she might begin to pull but then switch to a lifter, and then only the other one will respond. So we can actually look into that. And of course, viscoelastic means that at some point over long time scales, there is actually no force transmitted because of the essentially fluidizing the spring, because of the viscous effect. So that will actually mean even a stronger softening and the delaying of the dynamics as compared to simply having soft springs. Yeah.
A couple of things come to mind. One is when you're looking at this flexible bounded object, that was really fascinating at the end there. And I would have thought for the sort of the modeling, and I know you've done a lot of work on single cells. I mean, do people model single cells as basically being like spins on the edge of the cell, making collective decisions regarding where to go? Because certainly, like the groups that we look at, like the collections of cells, looks kind of like this, right? If you think about how does a single cell solve this type of challenge, you need to have the parts of the cell pulling and parts of the cell basically giving up on pulling and just allowing themselves to be moved. I mean, is this analogous to that? Have you done any modeling that relates this to say how cell boundaries may interact with each other? Because again, you have these forces propagating across the individual cell.
Exactly. So it's a fantastic analogy. So we have thought about that, and actually, you know, in one cell migration conference, I was talking about this analogy, but specifically with a flexible object, it's more complicated to think about the cell, of course, because the cell has hydrodynamics in it, and it's not like just a simple empty elastic string like here. But what we have done is forget about the shape changes and think about a model of a circular cell. And along the edge of this circular cell, you have what we call motile units, which can be a unit which can either make some traction forces on the substrate on which the cell is sitting on or adhering to, and can be off, which means that essentially, like you said, it's detached, or it's like the lifter in this analogy. And indeed, we have a model like that, and I have a student, in fact, the same Jonathan that did this work on the bistability. In his PhD, he switched to modeling cell migration, and he has exactly a model for how a circular cell is moving around by such motile units switching on and off. And in fact, it's similar to this spin model with the ants, only that it's slightly more complicated, because we believe that in the cells, it's not purely the mechanical information which is transmitted, but there's also some chemical field within the cell which is polarized between front and left, front and back, and that actually makes this spin model have, instead of just being an ordered and a disordered phase, also a phase which is sort of intermittent. And
we should maybe talk about placozoa, because there's very good evidence that really it's the boundary of this very sort of cluster of cells that really defines the motion, and it's the tough deformation in this boundary that seems really important. And it could be nice to think about whether this modeling could apply. And the other question I had with you, and I mean this is kind of a loaded question because we're working on this closely, and other people don't necessarily make this type of connection, but there's a deep similarity between this model and also our model of neural dynamics and how the brain makes decisions, right? And so watching these videos, you know, I wonder about how an individual animal, you know, finds an obstacle in its path, solves these types of challenges. And it wouldn't surprise me if a similar process also occurs at the level of the individual, in terms of...
That's cool. That's interesting,
similar reasons. And then I did also wonder, when I was looking at your geometries, whether you could, I guess you probably couldn't, but whether you could actually look at mazes, for example. Can ants using this algorithm solve more complex geometries such as mazes?
Okay. So first of all, to the first question, to the first idea that you raised, that actually a single ant employs maybe something similar on the single brain level when she's encountering an obstacle. That's a brilliant idea. I haven't thought about that, but it's completely in line of what we are collaborating on. So I agree.
About that actually, that was I was more thinking about the collection of ants being like the collection of neurons, right? So if this is now not a bunch of ants around a single object, but one brain trying to determine to get through this gap. I mean, a very similar model. I mean, our model of neural dynamics may well produce the same types of properties for the same types of reasons. That if you occluded, you begin to form these oscillations that will then allow you to get around the object. And it could
that would be brilliant to test. That would be brilliant to test for animals. Now, about the maze, there is a paper that I think came out earlier this year, I think earlier this year before the corona or at the end of last year. I don't know. I lost track of time. And that's an experimental paper where Ofer and Aviram, the guy who worked also on this, on the first projects that they showed, they did exactly a maze, just like you say. So there is a rigid object which has to move along a maze. It cannot actually squeeze into in between the object like the string. But they did not analyze those experiments in terms of this model. They did a much simpler analysis in terms of what would be sort of an algorithmic approach. Should I go right? Should I go left? And if I know that there is the correct path, how do I get to the correct path that gets me out of dead ends? And is it distance dependence, etc.? So it's a very algorithmic approach. So essentially, we have not tested this model in a maze, but the maze experiments have been done, so there is data. So one could do that if one wants.
Yeah, certainly the single cell models of mazes suggest that it's important to actually lay a negative trail. If you've been somewhere a lot and it's not led anywhere, you avoid going there again using it. And there's one controversial paper that suggests some ants have a negative pheromone as well as a positive pheromone, but it's never really been explored effectively. And I think that type of experiment, you might be able to find geometrical constraints whereby only a model with negative pheromone would be able to solve certain geometries, whereas a model like yours, just with positive sort of pheromone, would not be able to solve it. And then you could potentially ask whether ants, whether you have any evidence in reality for some sort of negative pheromone to allow some more complex problem solving.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and I should also stress, it's a good point to stress that the model that I showed you where an ant is simply deciding between a binary choice of whether lifting or pulling, and also whether to attach or detach, that's a huge simplification. And we actually have evidence that even when she's attached to the object, she can do other things as well. For example, she can walk sideways, which means that she can produce a pure torque without any pulling at all. So she has also this ability to like another gait of her 6 legs. And of course, an ant has more than just this simple binary decision to decide. Even a forager ant during her entire life business, and even in the context of leaving the carrying group, sniffing out the central, coming back as an informed ant, forgetting about the direction and continuing as a regular carrying ant. So I'm just wanting to say that even the ant is a much more complicated object than just this binary spin, but I'm just saying that this simplification allowed us to go a long way in explaining this phenomena. And I think at least we showed that, for example, in the way that we recovered directly the antulum, the pendulum-like oscillations, with the same model that we built for free motion without any changes, as well as these large sideways oscillations along an obstacle. I think it's a strong vindication for this kind of approach, which is, as I said, it's a huge simplification of what an ant really is or does.
No, absolutely. Wonderful.
Yeah.
I didn't want to ask, might be that's the physical, but since you make this beautiful analogy with the Ising model. What about the spatial? You have your order parameter, right, which is, so to say, the magnetization. And in principle, the Ising model, you can also make a prediction regarding the dynamics of the order parameter, right? dMdt, and the beautiful thing is, essentially all you have to know is the time reciprocal symmetry of your order parameter, right? This tells you whether dMdt only depends on odd or even powers of m, right? This is what you normally do when you analyze the Ising model. Is that something you have done? Because I haven't seen, you haven't looked that much into the dynamics. I've seen it for the oscillation, but
yeah, so the dynamics, as you know, the dynamics of the spin system. Okay, first of all, it's an Ising model without any spatial component, because all the spins are talking to all the spins.
No, this is fine. Yep.
Yeah, so it's a system where you know that actually the mean field is the exact solution in the large end limit, in the thermodynamic limit, and you can simulate the system, of course, at any finite size using a Gillespie algorithm, but you can also work out the dynamical equations, by expanding up to short times. So taking into account only the single spin flip events, and again assuming that there's no higher order correlations. And you know that since everything should go to the mean field, you can use that assumption and use the mean field values. And then you write essentially a system of dynamical equations. You don't need to now have individual spins anymore. It's a continuum of, as you said, of the dynamics of the total magnetization, which for us was also the speed of the object. And now you can basically analyze this as a nonlinear dynamical system, just like we did for the Antulum, but you can also do it for the free system, which will basically show you that there is an Ising transition from having a single peak around v equals 0 to a double peak around the two values which are peaked at the mean field values. And you can do a Fokker-Planck solution, write the Fokker-Planck equation and solve it for the steady state distribution and do all of that. So that's all done. What is actually interesting when you do that analysis is to calculate, and that's not so easy, and analytically we can only give approximations of it using the Kramer theory for the rate at which you switch direction. So assume that you have your system along one dimension, it can be magnetized to the left or to the right, and there is some switching probability. And of course, that switching probability becomes much smaller the cooler you cool the system, or in other words, also the larger you make the system. Now, why does the size affect here like temperature? And that's the reason is that we assume that an end feels the force of all the other ends. It's not like in the Hamiltonian that you usually write, which you add the factor of 1 over n outside the Hamiltonian in order to take correctly the thermodynamic limit. If you don't have this 1 over n outside, all your energies actually explode to infinity once you take an infinite number of spins in your system. But in our case, we don't think that there is this 1 over n outside in the Hamiltonian or in these exponential factors for the ends, because they really are affected by all the other ends. So they can really tell if they are now holding on to an object that 50 other ends are pulling or just 10 other ends are pulling. So they are, and that's the reason that the size makes them more conformist, because the size is essentially making the denominator larger, which is equivalent to making the temperature in the numerator, the numerator larger, which is equivalent to making the denominator smaller. So large size system is equivalent to cooler temperatures.
Sure, yeah. Another question I had is, because you can map it to simulations, to a theory, is the strategy for transportation, is that the ideal strategy? You can, in principle, I understand you find perfect experimental evidence for the model, but once you have a model, of course, you can play around, you can modify things. is that really, or in what sense, let me put it like that, in what sense this, so to say, this strategy, this policy
is optimal.
Optimal, exactly. That's the question, right? I mean, biologists always tell us it is optimized for something regarding something, but what is it, right?
So it's a good question, and I can only say that, you know, from this peak in the response as function of size, you can say, okay, so there is a certain size range of objects for which these ends are maximally responsive to this information of the informed ends.
Okay.
And then you say, okay, it's about between 0.5 centimeter and 1 centimeter. So, or between 0.5 centimeter and a bit over 1 centimeter. That's 1.5 centimeters. So what's so special about this size range of 0.5 centimeter to 1.5 centimeters? And you find that this size range, you know, as a radius, so as a circumference, it's 2 pi times that length, you know, fits at most about 30 ends and as little as about 7 ends. And in this size range of a carrying group of 7 ends to about 30, you can actually carry most of the insects that they come across. Now, you know, you can say, okay, but what happens if they find a very large insect, or I don't know, a dead mouse? Won't they carry the dead mouse to the nest? Well, they don't. And you can say, well, why don't they? But first of all, even if they could carry it, and let's say that they could recruit enough of them to carry it, they cannot push it into the nest because the nest has a hole of a certain size. Now you can say, okay, but what determines the size of the hole to the nest? There's other considerations from evolution, not being open to predators, not being open to rain too much, I don't know. So there's layers upon layers of optimization here, but at the end of the day, it seems that for the insects that they are interested in, which are, you know, from small maggots and small flies to, or other dead ants, to big cockroaches and you know, pretty much you know, large locusts and things like that, they are near this optimum of being responsive. So. At least we can say that evolution wanted them to be responsive to the information that is injected by these flux of informed ants that are trying to steer them back to the nest through the scent trail.
Thank you.
Just from the perspective of the biologists, and I absolutely agree with you, Clemens, that biologists have this problem of adaptive storytelling. They're looking for this line of argument that the problem that they think the animals are trying to solve, the animals are solving in an optimal way. Now, this is, of course, never true because it's unknowable what problems an animal is trying to solve and what the spread of problems. So exactly as Nir points out, this is not a single optimality front. This is a multiple optimality problem that may, you know, you could ask, why does an animal not do X when given this repeated task that happens every day, every 5 minutes? But then you can't know that every month it floods or it rains or something, and that completely shifts the adaptive strategy. And so that's, I think, the point here, is that these are adaptive strategies that solve a given task set. They're not optimal, and even if there was
but they have to be robust. I mean, this is clear.
They have to be robust and flexible.
It has to be robust to changing environments. And actually, and I think apart from, in addition to what you said, the prey has to fit into the nest. I think one issue is, and that this explains also why they are not interested in a mouse. They have to be sufficiently fast, because otherwise they compete with others. And I would say this is also limits a little bit. No, I understand. Of course,
that's a key. Clemens, that's a key criteria. They have to get back to the nest very fast. Because there's competing ants from neighboring colonies. And also, you know, in one experiment, while the movie was taken, a bird came down, ate the Cheerio with those ants which were carrying it, and just flew away.
You have to be sufficiently fast. That makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Beautiful.
But you know, Clemens, it was actually when we first said that the animals, these ants, are close to a phase transition, and therefore they are sort of at the transition point. Yes, this notion was around that animal groups have something to gain from being close to a phase transition. But on the other hand, other people told me, well, you know, I don't believe that biology wants to be close to a phase transition. Why? Because it's an unstable place to be, and it's where you're most susceptible to noise. And, you know, so people can give you lots of arguments, but
I would disagree. I mean, it's still a stable point. I mean, even if you're at a critical point, it doesn't mean that you completely fluctuate away. And
no.
I think the having a high responsiveness for an animal, this is that's something, right?